Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom with Chapter 1, The Relation Between Economic Freedom and Political Freedom. As always, we'll be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video's description to that part of the video so that you can skip straight to the analysis and review part of the video if that's how you'd like to go about things. So, without further ado, let's dive into tonight's read in Chapter 1, The Relation Between Economic Freedom and Political Freedom. It is widely believed that politics and economics are separate and largely unconnected, that individual freedom is a political problem and material welfare an economic problem, and that any kind of political arrangements can be combined with any kind of economic arrangements. The chief contemporary manifestation of this idea is the advocacy of quote-unquote democratic socialism by many who condemn out of hand the restrictions on individual freedom imposed by quote-unquote totalitarian socialism in Russia, and who are persuaded that it is possible for a country to adopt the essential features of Russian economic arrangements, and yet to ensure individual freedom through political arrangements. The thesis of this chapter is that such a view is a delusion, that there is an intimate connection between economics and politics, that only certain combinations of political and economic arrangements are possible, and that in particular, a society which is socialist cannot also be democratic in the sense of guaranteeing individual freedom. Economic arrangements play a dual role in the promotion of a free society. On the one hand, freedom in economic arrangements is itself a component of freedom broadly understood, so economic freedom is an end in itself. In the second place, economic freedom is also an indispensable means toward the achievement of political freedom. The first of these roles of economic freedom needs special emphasis because intellectuals in particular have a strong bias against regarding this aspect of freedom as important. They tend to express contempt for what they regard as material aspects of life and to regard their own pursuit of allegedly higher values as on a different plane of significance and as deserving of special attention. For most citizens of the country, however, if not for the intellectual, the direct importance of economic freedom is at least comparable in significance to the indirect importance of economic freedom as a means to political freedom. The citizen of Great Britain who, after World War II, was not permitted to spend his vacation in the United States because of exchange control, was being deprived of an essential freedom no less than the citizen of the United States who was denied the opportunity to spend his vacation in Russia because of his political views. The one was ostensibly an economic limitation on freedom, and the other a political limitation, yet there is no essential difference between the two. The citizen of the United States who is compelled by law to devote something like 10% of his income to the purchase of a particular kind of retirement contract administered by the government is being deprived of a corresponding part of his personal freedom. How strongly this deprivation may be felt and its closeness to the deprivation of religious freedom, which all would regard as quote-unquote civil or quote-unquote political rather than quote-unquote economic, was dramatized by an episode involving a group of farmers of the Amish sect. On grounds of principle, this group regarded compulsory federal old age programs as an infringement of their personal individual freedom and refused to pay taxes or accept benefits. As a result, some of their livestock were sold by auction in order to satisfy claims for Social Security levies. True, the number of citizens who regard compulsory old age insurance as a deprivation of freedom may be few, but the believer in freedom has never counted noses. A citizen of the United States who, under the laws of various states, is not free to follow the occupation of his own choosing unless he can get a license for it, is likewise being deprived of an essential part of his freedom. So is the man who would like to exchange some of his goods with, say, a Swiss for a watch, but is prevented from doing so by a quota. So also is the Californian who was thrown into jail for selling Alka-Seltzer at a price below set by the manufacturer under so-called quote-unquote fair trade laws. So also is the farmer who cannot grow the amount of wheat he wants, and so on. Clearly, economic freedom, in and of itself, is an extremely important part of total freedom. Viewed as a means to the end of political freedom, economic arrangements are important because of their effect on the concentration or dispersion of power. The kind of economic organization that provides economic freedom directly, namely competitive capitalism, also promotes political freedom because it separates economic power from political power, and in this way enables the one to offset the other. Historical evidence speaks with a single voice on the relation between political freedom and a free market. I know of no example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom, and that has also not used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. Because we live in a largely free society, we tend to forget how limited is the span of time and the part of the globe for which there has ever been anything like political freedom. The typical state of mankind is tyranny, servitude, and misery. The 19th century and early 20th century in the Western world stand out as striking exceptions to the general trend of historical development. Political freedom in this instance clearly came along with the free market and the development of capitalist institutions. So also did political freedom in the golden age of Greece and in the early days of the Roman era. History suggests only that capitalism is a necessary condition for political freedom. Clearly, it is not a sufficient condition. Fascist Italy and fascist Spain, Germany at various times in the last 70 years, Japan before World Wars I and II, Tsarist Russia in the decades before World War I, are all societies that cannot conceivably be described as politically free. Yet, in each, private enterprise was the dominant form of economic organization. It is therefore clearly possible to have economic arrangements that are fundamentally capitalist and political arrangements that are not free. Even in those societies, the citizenry had a good deal more freedom than citizens of a modern totalitarian state like Russia or Nazi Germany, in which economic totalitarianism is combined with political totalitarianism. Even in Russia, under the Tsars, it was possible for some citizens, under some circumstances, to change their jobs without getting permission from political authority because capitalism and the existence of private property provided some check to the centralized power of the state. The relation between political and economic freedom is complex and by no means unilateral. In the early 19th century, Bentham and the philosophical radicals were inclined to regard political freedom as a means to economic freedom. They believed that the masses were being hampered by the restrictions that were being imposed upon them, and that if political reform gave the bulk of the people to vote, they would do what was good for them, which was to vote for laissez-faire. In retrospect, one cannot say that they were wrong. There was a large measure of political reform that was accompanied by economic reform in the direction of a great deal of laissez-faire. An enormous increase in the well-being of the masses followed this change in economic arrangements. The triumph of Benthamite liberalism in 19th century England was followed by a reaction toward increasing intervention by government in economic affairs. This tendency to collectivism was greatly accelerated both in England and elsewhere by the two world wars. Welfare, rather than freedom, became the dominant note in democratic countries. Recognizing the implicit threat to individualism, The intellectual descendants of the philosophical radicals, Dicey, Mises, Hayek, and Simons, to mention only a few, feared that a continued movement towards centralized control of economic activity would prove the road to serfdom, as Hayek entitled his penetrating analysis of the process. Their emphasis was on economic freedom as a means towards political freedom. Events since the end of World War II display still a different relation between economic and political freedom. Collectivist economic planning has indeed interfered with individual freedom. At least in some countries, however, the result has not been the suppression of freedom, but the reversal of economic policy. England, again, provides the most striking example. The turning point was perhaps the quote-unquote control of engagements order, which, despite great misgivings, the Labour Party found it necessary to impose in order to carry out its economic policy. Fully enforced and carried through, the law would have involved centralized allocation of individuals to occupations. This conflicted so sharply with personal liberty that it was enforced in a negligible number of cases and then repealed after the law had been in effect for only a short period. Its repeal ushered in a decided shift in economic policy, marked by reduced reliance on centralized plans and programs, by the dismantling of many controls, and by increased emphasis on the private market. A similar shift in policy occurred in most other democratic countries. The proximate explanation of these shifts in policy is the limited success of central planning, or its outright failure to achieve stated objectives. However, this failure is itself to be attributed, at least in some measure, to the political implications of central planning and to an unwillingness to follow out its logic when doing so requires trampling roughshod on treasured private rights. It may well be that the shift is only a temporary interruption in the collectivist trend of this century. Even so, it illustrates the close relation between political freedom and economic arrangements. Historical evidence by itself can never be convincing. Perhaps it was sheer coincidence that the expansion of freedom occurred at the same time as the development of capitalist and market institutions. Why should there be a connection? What are the logical links between economic and political freedom? In discussing these questions, we shall consider first the market as a direct component of freedom, and then the indirect relation between market arrangements and political freedom. A byproduct will be an outline of the ideal economic arrangements for a free society. As liberals, we take freedom of the individual, or perhaps the family, as our ultimate goal in judging social arrangements. Freedom as a value in this sense has to do with the interrelations among people. It has no meaning whatsoever to a Robinson Crusoe on an isolated island without his man Friday. Robinson Crusoe on his island is subject to quote-unquote constraint. He has limited quote-unquote power, and he has only a limited number of alternatives, but there is no problem of freedom in the sense that is relevant to our discussion. Similarly, in a society, freedom has nothing to say about what an individual does with his freedom. It is not an all-embracing ethic. Indeed, a major aim of the liberal is to leave the ethical problem for the individual to wrestle with. The quote-unquote really important ethical problems are those that face an individual in a free society. What he should do with his freedom. There are thus two sets of values that a liberal will emphasize. The values that are relevant to relations among people, which is the context in which he assigns first priority to freedom, and the values that are relevant to the individual and the exercise of his freedom, which is the realm of individual ethics and philosophy. The liberal conceives of men as imperfect beings. He regards the problem of social organization to be as much a negative problem of preventing quote-unquote bad people from doing harm as of enabling quote-unquote good people to do good. And of course, quote-unquote bad and quote-unquote good people may be the same people depending on who is judging them. The basic problem of social organization is how to coordinate the economic activities of large numbers of people. Even in relatively backward societies, extensive division of labor and specialization of function is required to make effective use of available resources. In advanced societies, the scale on which coordination is needed to take full advantage of the opportunities offered by modern science and technology is enormously greater. Literally millions of people are involved in providing one another with their daily bread, let alone with their yearly automobiles. The challenge to the believer in liberty is to reconcile this widespread interdependence with individual freedom. Fundamentally, there are only two ways of coordinating the economic activities of millions. One is central direction, involving the use of coercion, the technique of the army and of the modern totalitarian state. The other is voluntary cooperation of individuals, the technique of the marketplace. The possibility of coordination through voluntary cooperation rests on the elementary, yet frequently denied, proposition that both parties to an economic transition benefit from it, provided the transaction is bilaterally voluntary and informed. Exchange can therefore bring about coordination without coercion. A working model of a society organized through voluntary exchange is a free enterprise exchange economy, what we have been calling competitive capitalism. In its simplest form, such a society consists of a number of independent households, a collection of Robinson Crusoes, as it were. Each household uses the resources it controls to produce goods and services that it exchanged for goods and services produced by other households on terms mutually acceptable to the two parties to the bargain. It is thereby enabled to satisfy its wants indirectly by producing goods and services for others, rather than directly by producing goods or for its own immediate use. The incentive for adopting this indirect route is, of course, the increased product made possible by division of labor and specialization of function. Since the household always has the alternative of producing directly for itself, it need not enter into any exchange unless it benefits from it. Hence, no exchange will take place unless both parties do benefit from it. Cooperation is thereby achieved without coercion. Specialization of function and division of labor would not go far if the ultimate productive unit were the household. In a modern society, we have gone much farther. We have introduced enterprises which are intermediaries between individuals in their capacities as suppliers of service and of purchasers of goods. And similarly, specialization of function and division of labor could not go very far if we had to continue to rely on the barter of product for product. In consequence, money has been introduced as a means of facilitating exchange and of enabling the acts of purchase and of sale to be separated into two parts. Despite the important role of enterprises and of money in our actual economy, and despite the numerous and complex problems they raise, the central characteristic of the market technique of achieving coordination is fully displayed in the simple exchange economy that contains neither enterprises nor money. As in the simple model, so in the complex enterprise and money exchange economy, cooperation is strictly individual and voluntary, provided a. that enterprises are private so that the ultimate contracting parties are individuals, and b. that individuals are effectively free to enter or not to enter into any particular exchange, so that every transaction is strictly voluntary. It is far easier to state these provisos in general terms than to spell them out in detail, or to specify precisely the institutional arrangements most conducive to their maintenance. Indeed, much of technical economic literature is concerned with precisely these questions. The basic requisite is the maintenance of law and order to prevent physical coercion of one individual by another and to enforce contracts voluntarily entered into, thus giving substance to quote-unquote private. Aside from this, perhaps the most difficult problems arise from monopoly, which inhibits effective freedom by denying individuals alternatives to the particular exchange, and from quote-unquote neighborhood effects on third parties for which it is not feasible to charge or recompense them. These problems will be discussed in more detail in the following chapter. So long as effective freedom of exchange is maintained, the central feature of the market organization of economic activity is that it prevents one person from interfering with another in respect of most of his activities. The consumer is protected from coercion by the seller because the presence of other sellers with whom he can deal. The seller is protected from coercion by the consumer because of other consumers to which he can sell. The employee is protected from coercion by the employer because of other employers for whom he can work, and so on. And the market does this impersonally and without centralized authority. Indeed, a major source of objection to a free economy is precisely that it does this task so well. It gives people what they want instead of what a particular group thinks they ought to want. Underlying most arrangements against the free market is a lack of belief in freedom itself. The existence of a free market does not, of course, eliminate the need for government. On the contrary, government is essential both as a forum for determining the quote-unquote rules of the game and as an umpire to interrupt and enforce the rules decided on. What the market does is to reduce greatly the range of issues that must be decided through political means, and thereby to minimize the extent to which government need participate directly in the game. The characteristic feature of action through political channels is that it tends to require or enforce substantial conformity. The great advantage of the market, on the other hand, is that it permits wide diversity. It is, in political terms, a system of proportional representation. Each man can vote, as it were, for the color of tie he wants and get it. He does not have to see what color the majority wants and then, if he is in the minority, submit. It is this feature of the market that we refer to when we say that the market provides economic freedom. But this characteristic also has implications that go far beyond the narrowly economic. Political freedom means the absence of coercion of a man by his fellow man. The fundamental threat to freedom is power to coerce, be it in the hands of a monarch, a dictator, an oligarchy, or a momentary majority. The preservation of freedom requires the elimination of such concentration of power to the fullest possible extent, and the dispersal and distribution of whatever power cannot be eliminated, a system of checks and balances. By removing the organization of economic activity from the control of political authority, the market eliminates this source of coercive power. It enables economic strength to be a check to the political power rather than a reinforcement. Economic power can be widely dispersed. There is no law of conservation which forces the growth of new centers of economic strength to be at the expense of existing centers. Political power, on the other hand, is more difficult to decentralize. There can be numerous small, independent governments, but it is far more difficult to maintain numerous equipotent small centers of political power in a single large government than it is to have numerous centers of economic strength in a single large economy. There can be many millionaires in one large economy, but there can But can there be more than one really outstanding leader? One person on whom the energies and enthusiasms of his countrymen are centered? If the central government gains power, it is likely to be at the expense of local governments. There seems to be something like a fixed total of political power to be distributed. Consequently, if economic power is joined to political power, concentration seems almost inevitable. On the other hand, if economic power is kept in separate hands from political power, it can serve as a check and a counter to political power. The force of this abstract argument can perhaps be demonstrated by example. Let us consider first a hypothetical example that may help to bring out the principles involved, and then some actual examples from recent experience that illustrate the way in which the market works to preserve political freedom. One feature of a free society is surely the freedom of individuals to advocate and propagandize openly for a radical change in the structure of the society, so long as the advocacy is restricted to persuasion and does not include force or other forms of coercion. It is a mark of the political freedom of a capitalist society that men can openly advocate and work for socialism. Equally, political freedom in a socialist society would require that men be free to advocate the introduction of capitalism. How could the freedom to advocate capitalism be preserved and protected in a socialist society? In order for men to advocate anything, they must, in the first place, be able to earn a living. This already raises a problem in a socialist society, since all jobs are under the direct control of political authorities. It would take an act of self-denial, whose difficulty is underlined by experience in the United States after World War II with the problem of quote-unquote security among federal employees, for a socialist government to permit its employees to advocate policies directly contrary to official doctrine. But let us suppose this act of self-denial to be achieved. For advocacy of capitalism to mean anything, the proponents must be able to finance their cause, to hold public meetings, publish pamphlets, buy radio time, issue newspapers and magazines, and so on. How could they raise the funds? There might and probably would be men in a socialist society with large incomes, perhaps even large capital sums, in the form of government bonds and the like, but these would of necessity be high public officials. It is possible to conceive of a minor socialist official retaining his job, although openly advocating capitalism. It strains credulity to imagine the socialist top brass financing such quote-unquote subversive activities. The only recourse for funds would be to raise small amounts from a large number of minor officials. But this is no real answer. To tap these sources, many people would already have to be persuaded, and our whole problem is how to initiate and finance a campaign to do so. Radical movements in capitalist societies have never been financed this way. They have typically been supported by a few wealthy individuals who have become persuaded by a Frederick Vanderbilt Field, or an Anita McCormick Blaine, or a Corliss Lamont, to mention a few names recently prominent, or by a Friedrich Engels, to go further back. This is a role of inequality of wealth in preserving political freedom that is seldom noted, the role of the patron. In a capitalist society, it is only necessary to convince a few wealthy people to get funds to launch any idea, however strange, and there are many such persons, many independent foci of support. And indeed, it is not even necessary to persuade people or financial institutions with available funds of the soundness of the ideas to be propagated. It is only necessary to persuade them that the propagation can be financially successful, that the newspaper or magazine or book or other venture will be profitable. The competitive publisher, for example, cannot afford to publish only writing with which he personally agrees. His touchstone must be the likelihood that the market will be large enough to yield a satisfactory return on his investment. In this way, the market breaks the vicious circle and makes it possible ultimately to finance such ventures by small amounts from many people without first persuading them. There are no such possibilities in a socialist society. There is only the all-powerful state. Let us stretch our imagination and suppose that a socialist government is aware of this problem and is composed of people anxious to preserve freedom. Could it provide the funds? Perhaps, but it is difficult to see how. It could establish a bureau for subsidizing subversive propaganda. But how could it choose whom to support? If it gave to all who asked, it would shortly find itself out of funds, for socialism cannot repeal the elementary economic law that a sufficiently high price will call forth a large supply. Make the advocacy of radical causes sufficiently remunerative, and the supply of advocates will be unlimited. Moreover, freedom to advocate unpopular causes does not require that such advocacy be without cost. On the contrary, no society could be stable if advocacy of radical change were costless, much less subsidized. It is entirely appropriate that men make sacrifices to advocate causes in which they deeply believe. Indeed, it is important to preserve freedom only for people who are willing to practice self-denial, for otherwise freedom degenerates into license and irresponsibility. What is essential is that the cost of advocating unpopular causes be tolerable and not prohibitive. But we are not yet through. In a free market society, it is enough to have the funds. The suppliers of paper are as willing to sell it to the daily worker as to the Wall Street Journal. In a socialist society, it would not be enough to have the funds. The hypothetical supporter of capitalism would have to be persuaded a government factory making paper to sell them. The hypothetical supporter of capitalism would have to persuade a government factory making paper to sell to him, the government press to print his pamphlets, and the government post office to distribute them among the people, a government agency to rent him a hall in which to talk, and so on. Perhaps there is some way in which one could overcome these difficulties and preserve freedom in a socialist society. One cannot say it is utterly impossible. What is clear, however, is that there are very real difficulties in establishing institutions that will effectively preserve the possibility of dissent. So far as I know, none of the people who have been in favor of socialism and also in favor of freedom have really faced up to this issue, or made even a respectable start at developing the institutional arrangements that would permit freedom under socialism. By contrast, it is clear how a free market capitalist society fosters freedom. A striking practical example of these abstract principles is the experience of Winston Churchill. From 1933 to the outbreak of World War II, Churchill was not permitted to talk over the British radio, which was, of course, a government monopoly administered by the British Broadcasting Corporation. Here was a leading citizen of his country, a member of Parliament, a former cabinet minister, a man who was desperately trying by every device possible to persuade his countrymen to take steps to ward off the menace of Hitler's Germany. He was not permitted to talk over the radio to the British people because the BBC was a government monopoly and his position was too, quote-unquote, controversial. Another striking example, reported in the January 26, 1959 issue of Time, has to do with the quote-unquote blacklist fade-out. Says the Time story, and this is a very long quote, The Oscar awarding ritual is Hollywood's biggest pitch for dignity. But 2 years ago, dignity suffered when one Robert Rich was announced as top writer for The Brave One, he never stepped forward. Robert Rich was a pseudonym, masking one of about 150 writers, blacklisted by the industry since 1974 as suspected communists or fellow travelers. The case was particularly embarrassing because the Motion Picture Academy had barred any communist or Fifth Amendment pleader from Oscar competition. Last week, both the communist rule and the mystery of Rich's identity were suddenly rescripted. Rich turned out to be Dalton, Johnny Gets His Gun, Trumbo, one of the original quote-unquote Hollywood 10 writers who refused to testify at the 1947 hearings on communism in the movie industry. Said producer Frank King, who had stoutly insisted that Robert Rich was a, quote, a young gun in Spain with a beard, end quote. Quote, "We have an obligation to our stockholders to buy the best script we can. Trumbo brought us The Brave One, and we bought it." End quote. In effect, it was the formal end of the Hollywood blacklist. For barred writers, the informal end came long ago. At least 15% of current Hollywood films are reportedly written by blacklist members. Said producer King, quote, "There are more ghosts in Hollywood than in Forest Lawn. Every company in town has used the work of blacklisted people. We're just the first to confirm what everyone knows." Closed quote. End quote. One may believe, as I do, that communism would destroy all of our freedoms. One may be opposed to it as firmly and as strongly as possible, and yet, at the same time, also believe that in a free society, it is intolerable for a man to be prevented from making voluntary arrangements with others that are mutually attractive because he believes in or is trying to promote communism. His freedom includes his freedom to promote communism. Freedom also, of course, includes the freedom of others not to deal with him under those circumstances. The Hollywood blacklist was an unfree act that destroys freedom because it was a collusive arrangement that used coercive means to prevent voluntary exchanges. It didn't work precisely because the market made it costly for people to preserve the blacklist. The commercial emphasis, the fact that people who are running enterprises have an incentive to make as much money as they can, protected the freedom of the individuals who were blacklisted by providing them with an alternative form of employment and by giving people an incentive to employ them. If Hollywood and the movie industry had been government enterprises, or if in England it had been a question of employment by the British Broadcasting Corporation, it is difficult to believe that the Hollywood 10, or their equivalent, would have found employment. Equally, it is difficult to believe that under those circumstances, strong proponents of individualism and private enterprise, or indeed strong proponents of any view other than the status quo, would be able to get employment. Another example of the role of the market in preserving political freedom was revealed in our experience with McCarthyism. Entirely aside from the substantive issues involved and the merits of the charges made, what protection did individuals, and in particular government employees, have against irresponsible accusations and probings into matters that it went against their conscience to reveal? Their appeal to the Fifth Amendment would have been a hollow mockery without an alternative to government employment. Their fundamental protection was the existence of a private market economy in which they could earn a living. Here again, the protection was not absolute. Many potential private employers were, rightly or wrongly, averse to hiring those pilloried. It may well be that there was far less justification for the costs imposed on many of the people involved than for the costs generally imposed on people who advocate unpopular causes. But the important point is that the costs were limited and not prohibitive, as they would have been if government employment had been the only possibility. It is of interest to note that a disproportionately large fraction of the people involved apparently went into the most competitive sectors of the economy: small business, trade, farming, where the market approaches most closely the ideal free market. No one who buys bread knows whether the wheat from which it is made was grown by a communist or a Republican, by a constitutionalist or a fascist, or, for that matter, by a Negro or a white. This illustrates how an impersonal market separates economic activities from political views and protects men from being discriminated against in their economic activities for reasons that are irrelevant to their productivity, whether these reasons are associated with their views or their color. As this example suggests, the groups in our society that have the most at stake in the preservation and strengthening of competitive capitalism are those minority groups which can most easily become the object of the distrust and enmity of the majority: the Negroes, the Jews, the foreign-born, to mention only the most obvious. Yet, paradoxically enough, the enemies of the free market, the socialists and communists, have been recruited in disproportionate measure from these groups. Instead of recognizing that the existence of the market has protected them from the attitudes of their fellow countrymen, they mistakenly attribute the residual discrimination to the market. That concludes tonight's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So there is an awful lot that goes on in this chapter that we're just not going to cover in this analysis and review, because honestly, I could go over every single sentence in this chapter, because in this chapter, he's laying out the main thesis for the entire book, and he's laying out the main structure for the entire book. So if there's something, excuse me, that we don't cover in this analysis and review that you'd like for me to talk about, I'd be happy to put together a separate video about some of these concepts. So let me know in the comment section if there's something that you'd like me to go about from this chapter that I don't cover in this analysis. And we're going to be focusing on that, the concept of the themes that he lays out in this chapter for the rest of the book, which begins with the opening sentence, of course. It is widely believed that politics and economics are separate and largely unconnected. So this is the thesis that he's going to reject and that he's going to spell out. And by the way, how many times have we heard this before in 2022 and 2023? The president doesn't have any control over the economy. So at the end of page 7 and continuing on to page 8, he actually spells out the thesis for what he says is the chapter, but it's really the thesis for the entire book. The thesis of this chapter is that such a view, which is that the president doesn't have any control over the economy, or that, economics isn't downstream of politics, is a delusion, that there is an intimate connection between economics and politics, that only certain combinations of political and economic arrangements are possible, and that in particular, a society which is socialist cannot also be democratic in the sense of guaranteeing individual freedom. So that's the main theme and thesis for not only this chapter, but the entirety of the book. So that's where we're going to be focusing on our conversation today with the analysis of this chapter. There are some things that kind of venture as a bit of an aside away from that. So we're not going to spend too much time on that. When he says a society which is socialist cannot also be democratic, Friedman is from the Chicago school rather than the Austrian school of economics. And although there's a lot of overlap, where those two differentiate is that the Austrian school would say, yes, this is true because it's axiomatically true. And the Chicago school would say, yes, it is true, and here's the evidence that it's true. And there's a reason that those two are different. And there's a reason that, in my view, economics is necessarily downstream of politics. And I've talked about this on my series on interference. What he's talking about is what I talked about in my series on interference. And he actually says explicitly in this chapter in a few places that what the free market is as a market environment which is free from interference. And what is interference? It's interference with mutually consensual transactions. So in this case, that's what we're talking about, which means that there's a lot that you can derive from all of that. Now, there is a bit of a philosophical conversation that I don't want to spend too much time on, and that stems from where the differences are between not the Chicago and the Austrian school, but where the differences are between those schools of thought and the socialist school of thought. I think page 9 better demonstrates the differences between Chicago and Austria when he says, I know of no example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. And that's true because it's axiomatically true. This is something that we can derive from the axioms of the human condition. And that's where the Chicago and Austrian school differentiate. However, the difference between the socialists that he would argue against with this book and the Chicago and Austrians is in the axiomatic. This is where his opposition is. And I think I'm going to use, just so we have a word to describe his opposition, which is part of why he's writing this book, I'm just going to use socialism and socialists broadly. Even though they go by different names and there are different sects of socialism, I don't think it really matters when it comes to the discussion of this book and Milton Friedman's theses in this book. We talked about in the introductory pages in the last analysis that this book broadly is just Milton Friedman's, it's just his thesis broadly on economics. It's getting into the mind of Milton Friedman when it comes to his economic principles, and thus you're kind of going to be venturing into the philosophical realm and getting into the mind of Milton Friedman in this way. And in doing so, he kind of lays out that fundamental difference I talked about between the socialist and the Austrian, let's say, on page 8. I think he actually does it unwittingly because he doesn't really expand upon this, but I think it's an excellent description of that difference. They, his opposition, the socialists, tend to express contempt for what they regard as material aspects of life and to regard their own pursuit of allegedly higher values as on a different plane of significance and as deserving of special attention. I don't think the socialists would actually disagree with his characterization of their worldview. Again, when he says they're on a different plane of their own pursuit of allegedly higher values on a different plane of significance, this is to say that they view their entire worldview is completely different from that of the Austrians. The quote that I've used, that I've heard, and I think it actually works really well, is they're using the same words, but not the same dictionary. So when they look at things like freedom, when they look at things like rights, they're using the same words, but they mean completely different things. And again, this difference is in the axiomatic place, is in the axiomatic. It's not in the arguments themselves. It's not in the logic behind the arguments. It's not in the basic premises that are accepted in developing a conclusion through an argument. It's not even in the process. It's before all of that. So when you have a conclusion, you have an argument. That argument is if it's well derived, is based on principles. And those principles, in the end, can be logically deduced from other principles, can be reasoned from other principles, but there's going to become a point where there's no way to reason or rationalize yourself into a position, and that's where we get to axia. That would be things like the idea that 3 is greater than 2. Why is 3 greater than 2? Well, there's really no answer to that. There's a how 3 is greater than 2, but there's not really a why. Like, why is it that we've decided to go 1, 2, 3 instead of 1, 3, 2? Why not just go 1, 3, 2? There's the idea that conclusions are derived through arguments from the premises, and you treat that as axiomatic to the logical order of things. But this is, I think, where the socialists would disagree. I think the socialists would completely disagree with everything that, say, the Austrian has adopted as axiomatic. Right? I think that they would be perfectly happy to espouse argumentative paradoxes because they don't believe in definitions in the way that the Austrian would believe in definitions. It's not that they don't share the definitions. They just don't share the definition of definition. So in the case of a socialist, they would say that a thing can simultaneously mean itself and its antonym. So this would be an argumentative paradox. They would say that there is no truth and there is no knowing, even though that sentence requires knowing that sentence is true. This is where you get the idea that war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and 2 + 2 = 5. Again, hearkening back to why is 3 greater than 2. And this is why they would reject Smith's lesson. Smith's lesson is something I've talked about endlessly on the show and in my series on interference. Do check it out. Link is in this description. And Friedman points that out on page 13, describes Smith's. I don't know if he's realizing that that's what he's describing, but he's described Smith's lesson on page 13. The possibility of coordination through voluntary cooperation rests on the elementary, yet frequently denied, proposition that both parties to an economic transition benefit from it, provided the transaction is bilaterally voluntary and informed. So that second part, bilaterally voluntary, I use the words mutually consensual. I think that's probably the better way to describe it, but it means basically the same thing. This is Smith's lesson. And again, it's based on one of the fundamental axioms, which is that there is such a thing as a human condition. And one of the elements of the human condition is that every man seeks, or at least desires, at every moment to be bettering his station in life. That doesn't mean that he's necessarily seeking it, but he definitely desires it. And from this we can derive the fundamental axiom of all of economics, which is scarcity, which is the idea that man's ability to desire greater consumption than he currently consumes will always exceed his capacity to produce in the moment. So this is something that the socialists simply reject on its face. And I've pulled, if you go back to my bookshelf, I have my economics textbook from college on the shelf, and I believe it's the second paragraph of the first chapter, and I believe it's the first sentence of the second chapter is that lesson in scarcity. It's not that scarcity can be avoided. It's just a fundamental characteristic of the human condition, right? Because human beings always desire to improve their station. Because of that, it is also axiomatically true that the human capacity to desire greater consumption will always exceed the human capacity to produce in the moment. And that is the concept of scarcity. So the socialists would use the word scarcity as a way to leverage say the way that the Austrian views scarcity, but not mean the same thing. And because, again, words can mean their opposite at the same time as simultaneous, words can mean themselves simultaneously to words meaning their antonym, as in they reject that A equals A. When you have something like the Motte and Bailey then becomes no longer a logical fallacy, but a useful tool. Because remember, when you don't have this fundamental structure, you have, in the case of the socialist, where they derive their axia are as being synonymous with the conclusion. So I told you that you have axiom, then you have principle, and then you have argument, and then you have conclusion, right? So there's a lot of layers in building to a conclusion from various axia. In the case of the socialists, they're treating the conclusion as axiomatic, which means that in this case, to the Austrian view, they're deriving their logic backwards, which means that there's no such thing as the logical fallacy, which means that when you have the Motte and Bailey, which I've talked about on the other channel, I'll put a link in this video's description to what the Motte and Bailey is. We don't have time to get into that. Again, this is the reason you see it used so often today by his opposition, the socialists, is that it isn't seen as a logical fallacy. It's seen as the proper and right thing. The word meaning carrying two simultaneously opposite meanings, so long as it is politically convenient. Because in this case, again, because you treat the conclusion as axiomatic, in this case, it doesn't matter how you get to it. So the arguments and the principles would bend towards the conclusion, which means that in this case, it's not that the ends are justifying the means. It's the means don't matter. The ends are the only thing that matters, which means that it's a good thing to use the Mott and Bailey when it serves the end, when it serves the conclusion, which is treated as axiomatic. It's also why you see so often the straw man. So where the Austrian, there's a lot of research on this matter. The Austrian can, when presented with a situation, they can articulate the position of their opposition fairly accurately. In this case, the socialist doesn't have the ability broadly today to characterize their opposition's position accurately. And that straw man is what leads to things like what we see on page 15 in the case in the case of the existence of government. The existence of a free market does not, of course, eliminate the need for government. Now, if you were to say to a socialist, what does capitalism look like? What does the free market look like when taken to its logical end? They would say anarchy. And in this case, Friedman, who would probably describe himself based on today's politics as a full-on libertarian, would disagree. That in a free market, in order to return mutual consent that he described previously as on page 13 in that previous quote, bilaterally voluntary. In order to return mutual consent to a transaction, sometimes you need a third party, and that third party is going to govern that transaction in the same way that a governor on a car governs the speed and RPM of a car. Right, so it doesn't get to a point where something would boil over or bubble over and blow up in your face. So you have, in the case of contract disputes, you have somebody come in and deal with a third party that's agreed to, an umpire, as he describes on page 15, to mediate that contract dispute. On the contrary, government is essential both as a form for determining the proverbial rules of the game, I'm adding the proverbial in there, and as an umpire to interpret and enforce the rules decided on. Because if you don't have that umpire, if you don't have that third party, if you don't have pre-agreed to rules of the game, you wind up just with a situation where everything dissolves into might makes right. Right? We've talked about on my other channel the concept of Farmer Brown and Farrier Smith to remove money from the entire situation, make it less confusing. Farmer Brown gives Farrier Smith oats in exchange for Farrier Smith's ferrying services for Farmer Brown's horses. Now what happens if Farrier Smith decides he's just going to go steal the oats? Well, he's broken that mutual consent, so you need a third party to come in and rectify that situation, because the two of them aren't going to rectify that situation, right? If Farrier Smith steals Farmer Brown's oats and Farmer Brown goes, "Hey man, I need my oats back. You stole them." Then and what happens if Farrier Smith just sits on his porch with a shotgun and says, "Come and get him," right? Like then we dissolve into just extreme violence that dissolves into might makes right. So there is something of a straw man on the side of the socialists that I'm sure you guys have heard today, where if you take the free market and free market principles to their logical end, they would argue that no, it needs to be controlled, it needs to be limited, and you're not really limiting it. You're not really limiting the principles of free market. You're just establishing the principles of free market. You have to have rules to the game, and rules to the game that are known, right, that are agreed upon. Even when you have a desert island situation and there's only 3 people on the island, if 2 people say, you know what, when we have a dispute, we're going to have this third person mediate that dispute, that's government. So, this is why that straw man exists. The other straw man that I think he tries to combat is on page 20. Again, I don't know if he's wittingly combating this. I don't know if he realizes that these exemplify the straw man versions of these underlying principles. On page 20, the Hollywood blacklist was an unfree act that destroys freedom because it was a collusive arrangement that used coercive means to prevent voluntary exchanges. So in this case, this would be a place for government to step in a certain way, because you have a collusive anti-competitive behavior, which means that if you have like every gas station in town says, shakes hands behind closed doors. We're not going to sell below $2. And if any other gas station comes in, we're going to strong arm them into not selling. We're going to either bribe them or strong arm them into not selling below $2 a gallon. And let's say that happens throughout the course of the state. Well, then there's no way for the consumer to exit that contract. There's no way for the consumer to exit those decisions. And because of the fact that there's no way to exit to exit that price point, right? Then you don't have mutual consent. Well, I don't want to pay $2 a gallon for gas. Well, tough luck. Right? There's no way to find some other means of obtaining that gas. And let's say that there is a way to sell the gas below $2 a gallon and make some money, right? Let's say some creative, risk-seeking entrepreneur decides they're going to open up a gas station. They want to sell at $1.80 a gallon. You and I know that if somebody sells at 20 cents a gallon cheaper, everyone in town is going to that gas station that sells at 20 cents a gallon cheaper, right? So in that case, if you didn't like the other gas stations, you could go to that gas station that sells at 20 cents a gallon cheaper. But now you can't. So there's no way to escape the contract, which means you can't possibly have consent in that. So in order to return mutual consent, you would break up collusive anti-competitive behavior. Now, these are kind of rare situations in a market environment. So, and they're almost always going to involve, he says, coercion. I would argue force in the case of some sort of physical force behind whatever actions that they're doing, at the very least, if not literally in the actions that they're doing. That's where those straw men appear, and that's kind of why they appear. I'll be happy to go into greater detail if you guys want me to in a completely different video. We're getting really long-winded already, and there's still kind of a lot to go over. So I don't want to get too much into the philosophy behind everything, except to say that the perfect example of the socialist, his opposition, just operating in a completely different plane where humans either don't exist or they aren't humans, right? We're appealing to something off in the ether, right, as a moral virtue that goes beyond the human condition, right? We're talking about making the human condition disappear. That we're talking about making humans angels, something that is a higher order of human than exists today. And this is where today you hear a lot of the Austrians consider socialism something of a religion and a religious appeal. In the Robinson Crusoe example that I don't remember what page he points this out on. I should be able to have this available to me. Oh, page 12 when he talks about the Robinson Crusoe example. And I want to explain this just because it can get kind of confusing. Here, with the Robinson Crusoe example, excluding assuming that he has no Friday, Friedman would call this example irrelevant to the discussion of the book because, in this case, if you don't have, in this case, scarcity becomes not necessarily all that relevant to the economic consideration because how do you have mutual consent in transactions? Well, there really isn't going to be any transactions. So, although there would be perfect mutual consent, there wouldn't be any transactions because there's no other human beings. And the entire point of economics is to discuss those transactions broadly. And the concept of scarcity still exists, but it becomes irrelevant. So Friedman here would say that the Robinson Crusoe thought experiment is irrelevant, but since the socialists reject scarcity in the first place and they're appealing to something off in the ether that exists on a higher plane, they actually wouldn't say that. They would say that it is relevant and that he doesn't have all of that freedom. So the libertarian would say today that the Robinson Crusoe is an example of someone who is obviously perfectly free, who experiences obviously perfect liberty, obviously perfect sovereignty, and that this is an obviously perfect example of, well, capitalism, because in the case of capitalism, he gets to keep his own or has total sovereignty over his human capital. Everything that he does, his labor is an extension of him himself. You know, he mixes his blood with the soil, as Smith once said. I think it was Smith that said that. And because his labor is an extension of him, everything that he exchanges for his labor must thus be his. This is how you get to property rights, which, of course, the socialists just on its face reject, right? Because none of these things are the goal. Even though they might say they are, they're using the words to mean something completely different. In this case, they're only using the words that the libertarian would use because they are words that are effective at achieving the end. They're mere guttural utterances that people broadly like. When you hear these sounds, you like these sounds. Therefore, we're going to use them to leverage that appeal to describe something completely different, right? So they would say that, simultaneously meaning something completely different and very much the same to what the libertarians would say, or the Austrians would say. Let's say this is the paradox of convenience I talked about before. It's that they're appealing to something off in the ether that's not measurable, not detectable by any of the senses, not observable, not something that can be logically deduced, but that must be just taken as being off in the ether on faith. Again, this is why Marxist socialism, at the very least, is usually described by the Austrian as something of a religion, right? So there's something off in the ether that is oppressing him. Because what you'll find is that if you have one of these Robinson Crusoe situations, and let's make it so that it's not a man stranded on an island and there are other human beings. Let's say it's the last man standing. Let's say there's some zombie apocalypse, some naturally existing disease that wipes out all of humanity. And let's say it's airborne rabies. Rabies goes airborne, and man, it just wipes out all of human existence. And, and the zombies all starve out, and it's long after the zombie apocalypse. And this man just happened to be born with the genetics, a genetic immunity to airborne rabies, right? And in this situation, his life is not going to be easy. His life is going to be really hard. At the very least, at first, it's going to be incredibly hard, right? And there is this element of the human condition that is, life is hard, right? And in this case, since the socialists would reject everything right down to human agency, in this case, they would say he's being oppressed by the fact that life is hard, right? That's something off in the ether is oppressing him. So therefore, he doesn't have the freedom to, make videos like this and just sit on his ass in a nice comfy chair like this, like I have right now, and make these type of videos. He doesn't have that freedom. But he does have that freedom. He just doesn't have the available resources available to him. So in this case, they would say he's oppressed by the fact that life is hard. And it's obvious the only way that he can rectify that situation is himself, by doing the things himself to make life not hard. But then if he makes life not hard, then he becomes bourgeois, right? Then he becomes the oppressor. Who is he oppressing? Well, again, it's off in the ether, right? It's a higher moral plane that's being appealed to than the tangible, visible one that everyone else on Earth sees, measures, observes, can logically deduce, right? So because he becomes bourgeois, he must then impoverish himself to rectify that class conflict, right? So then that he would be oppressed because he would be impoverished and life would be back to being hard. So then he must do all of those things himself to become bourgeois, and then he must impoverish himself. And then we have that endless cycle. So in this case, that endless cycle is by itself a paradox. But again, the socialists, the opposition to Friedman here, would argue that either it isn't a paradox, or they would say it isn't a paradox and then use paradox to mean something completely different. And that's where you would get something of the Mott and Bailey. Future Mike jumping in here during editing because past Mike is doing an inadequate job of explaining these concepts without using the examples of the words exploit and labor. The word exploit has two very different definitions, which carry with them two very different connotations. It could mean the obviously innocuous to make use of, or to capture an advantage, in the way that Tom Hanks's character in the movie Castaway exploited the length of a stick by fastening the blade of an ice skate to it in order to capture the mechanical advantage of leverage. It could also be used in the pejorative to mean to abuse, which carries an obviously negative connotation, to exploit the innocence and naivete of a child by, say, sexually abusing them, The socialist uses both definitions simultaneously and alternately when describing the relationship with labor, which can mean physical exertion or literal calories burned in the case of a ditch digger, which carries an obvious negative connotation, or it can merely mean providing a service, as in the case of an expert providing either creative insight or technical support over the phone while wearing pajamas in the comfort of their own homes, which carries an obviously innocuous connotation. The definitions are different and carry obviously different connotations, but again, are used both simultaneously and alternately by the socialist as it suits convenience. This is because at the root of the socialist moral paradigm, is something beyond consent, which is derived from the idea that endemic to the human condition is agency. Where the Austrian would argue that all that matters between labor relationships is consent, the socialist would argue that because this will necessarily lead sometimes to conditions in the moment that some people might not consider ideal, the relationship must be not good, or at least not ideal, and therefore exploitative. But because the root of what matters morally in the Austrian paradigm is consent, the results of the path that a man chooses are the results that he chooses, and therefore the results are immaterial to the question of consent. This is obviously axiomatically true, so in order to achieve the desired result, the socialist must bend the definitions of exploit and labor to simultaneously and alternately mean two different things, because even to the Austrian, it is obviously true that Farmer Brown is technically exploiting the labor of Farrier Smith in the innocuous manner that the ancient builder exploited the pulley for mechanical advantage and thus material advantage. The word must bounce around instantaneously between the two definitions, as does the idea of labor. It's also why the socialist rejects the idea of your labor being an extension of you, that you can exchange for goods and services which you own, which is the basis for property rights, and why the socialist rejects the idea of property rights. But knowing how unpalatable that is must invent the idea of personal versus private property. Words which in the economic context are synonyms, as in a personal choice versus a private choice to, say, get an abortion, but have to be used to simultaneously and alternately be synonyms and antonyms as it suits the greater end of evening the score rather than leveling the playing field. The goal of the socialist is the even score, which means they have to have something occupy the space of consent, and from there, reject agency as being endemic to the human condition, and then further, reject the axioms of there being things endemic to the human condition as either being non-existent or simply immoral hurdles that need to be somehow overcome. Where the Austrian would argue those hurdles cannot be overcome because a thing being endemic to the human condition axiomatically cannot be overcome because it's endemic to the human condition, here the socialist disagrees. And it is here, in the axiomatic, that the socialist disagrees with the Austrian. So that's the philosophical differences between, say, the Austrian and the socialist that he's going to... I don't know how much time he's going to spend on that in this book, but that is what he's talking about and why those differences exist. And I think it might be unwitting that he's doing this because he is something of a Chicago schooler, where the Austrian would say, no, these are differences on principle. And in fact, they're not even really differences on principle. These are philosophical differences. Whereas the Chicago school would say, well, we disagree, and here's the thing that we can evidence in the real world to disagree with that. And when you have these levels of differences, that's not going to work. Espousing the fundamental principles of economics that, say, the Austrian or the Chicago school would have, explaining what scarcity is, how the law of demand works, how the law of supply works, explaining things like Smith's law, is it Smith's law? No, Smith's lesson, to, in this case, the socialist, they're just going to reject those things on their face. So you might say, why am I even doing this series? Why am I doing these videos then? And that is because I think the people that are going to watch this are looking to get a better understanding of reality on the ground and not be appealing to some ethereal version of the human condition that doesn't exist, or ethereal version of humanity which doesn't exist. You have to change, Marx would actually agree with this, what a human is, right? A human is not an ant, right? The fundamental principles that Marx espoused relating to communism and socialism may work with ants. They don't work with human beings because human beings aren't ants. So then what we must do is make the human being the ant. It's a bit of a reduction, it's a bit of a cynical take, but I think it's pretty accurate characterization of those differences. So I'm doing this because I like the book, get over it. So we're going to read the book. I think that it allows people who are looking to better understand that those differences and to better understand those economic principles. Going through a read like this really helps. And that's basically where we're going to be done with the philosophical conversation for the rest of this book, because I think he goes into greater detail on those economic principles in the rest of the chapters throughout the course of this series. And that's really where we're going to be focusing, because that's really what I want to be focusing on with this series. And again, I don't know that he realizes that the root of these differences is in the axiomatic, is a philosophical discussion. So the last thing I want us to talk about very briefly, because we're going way over here on time with this analysis, we won't be doing this again because we won't have the philosophical conversation. We won't be going this long ever again in this read. It'll be under 20 minutes, I promise, from now on. So there may be some possible confusion in the second half in regards to money and politics. Let me know in the comment section if you want me to put out another video specific to that conversation. We can go in greater detail on that on another video. But I do want to point out that make a point of what he says on page 18. I'm going to run through this as quickly as I can. But we are not yet through. In a free market society, it is enough to have the funds. Again, this is in relation to building political will. The suppliers of paper are as willing to sell it to the daily worker as to the Wall Street Journal. In a socialist society, it would not be enough to have the funds. The hypothetical supporter of capitalism would have to persuade a government factory making paper to sell to him, the government printing press to print his pamphlets, a government post office to distribute them among the people, a government agency to rent him a hall in which to talk, and so on. Perhaps there is some way in which one could overcome these difficulties and preserve freedom in a socialist society. The answer in a word is money. But the socialist, again, strives towards that communist ideal, which is a rejection of money. And what you find in every society that's attempted this is that what you're looking for is a medium of exchange. It could be something like my business cards, right? And if you get rid of money like they did in the Soviet Union, you're still going to still need some medium of exchange, because a direct barter is a ridiculously and wildly and obviously incredibly inefficient way to perform exchange transactions. So you need some medium of exchange. And again, that might be just reduced to, all right, well, I've got some business cards laying around. We're going to use those as money. I got some rolls of toilet paper. We're going to use those as money, or as currency at the very least, a pure medium of exchange. And what you're going to find is that because humans aren't identical, because humans aren't ants, there are going to be humans that are going to be better at collecting these business cards, these medium of exchange, these currency tokens, right? Therefore, in the end, somebody's going to wind up with more of these business cards than other people, right? And this is endemic to the human condition. The socialist rejects that. The socialist rejects that there is that there are things that can be endemic to the human condition, and thus what they would do is either take the business cards from the people that have hoarded the most business cards, well, not hoarded, but have collected through mutual exchange the most mutually consensual exchange, the most business cards, and give to the ones that haven't, and thus make the whole point of the business card completely moot. And then we've got to find something else, right? It might just be pencils, right? Or what they would do, which is much more likely, because again, they reject money as being something that's just axiomatically, we'll call it evil, is get rid of the currency. Make it illegal to barter and exchange using business cards. But again, endemic to the human condition is the desire to improve your state, which means that you're going to want some means of performing an exchange which is more efficient than direct barter, which means you need currency, which they reject. So I don't know if Friedman realizes that that's the answer to that question, but the answer to that question is just one word: money or currency. And I want to go over briefly, since again, we're getting ridiculously long, where I slightly disagree with chapter 1. And in this conversation is on page 10. History suggests only that capitalism is a necessary condition for political freedom. This is true. Clearly, it is not a sufficient condition. Kind of also true. Fascist Italy and fascist Spain, Germany at various times in the last 70 years, Japan before World Wars I and II, Tsarist Russia and in the decades before World War I, are all societies that cannot conceivably be described as politically free. This is true. Yet, in each, private enterprise was the dominant form of economic organization. This is false. I think what he's referring to is Nazi Germany when he talks about Germany at various times in the last 70 years. In the case of the fascist, what you're doing with a fasci means to bind, right? Or a binding. You're binding, I think the literal words they used were you're binding the private sector with the public sector. You're binding the incorporated man with the body politic, right? That's why you have the bundle of sticks with the axe. The axe is being bound to the bundle of sticks, right? They may use the words private enterprise, but it means the same thing as government control. In the case of the National Socialists, when it comes to private enterprise, they allow private enterprise, but only as a means to the end, only as a means to create the master race, right? So you're allowed to engage in private enterprise if you agree with the Nazis, if you're of the Aryan race or something like that, and you're working towards an end to take down the Jews, right? So which is basically just Marx's idea of class conflict taken to racial conflict, applied directly, verbatim to race conflict, at least in the mind of Hitler. So in this case, Hitler synonymized the bourgeoisie with the Jews, and Hitler synonymized the proletariat with the Aryans, and saw the nation, Germany, as being the all-consuming brand under which you would have this racial Marxism for all intents and purposes. So, and this is where I would kind of disagree with him. It is therefore clearly possible to have economic arrangements that are fundamentally capitalist and political arrangements that are not free. This is where I would disagree. In order to have mutual consent, you have to have mutual consent, right? So in order to have the arrangements that are fundamentally capitalist, economic arrangements that are fundamentally capitalist, you must lack interference with mutual consent. If you have a political arrangement that necessarily interferes with mutual consent, then you cannot have an economic arrangement where you have mutual consent not being interfered with. So that's where I would disagree with him. This is actually one of the better reads within the course of this book. It does get better in our next read in chapter 2. It does kind of downhill from there, but it does improve in what is my favorite read in the book, which is what we'll be covering in the next read. Chapter 2, the role of government in a free society. So until then, it's been Mike, signing off.